Gadri were working with the German embassy through and through. Unfortunately, they were caught due to a number of different spies and a number of different reasons. The court case that came out of that was known as the Hindu-German conspiracy trial in San Francisco. At that moment, it was the largest, the longest, and the most expensive trial west of the Mississippi. Wow. There was an agreement made to send German weapons, and it was thousands of weapons and thousands of bullets, and along with Ghadar newspapers from here to ultimately to a port in India. And Baba Singh was amongst them, and they joined the British Army. But it was in 1906, 1907, Sardar Ajit Singh, who's the Chachaji of Shahid Bhagat Singh, they started the Pagdi Jata movement. And Baba Jawala Singh, who was one of the founders of Stockton Gurudwara Sahib and one of the key organizers of the Gadhar Lahore as well, he owned 500 acres of farmland in the Stockton area in the early 1900s.
ਵਾਹਿਗੁਰੂ ਜੀ ਕਾ ਖਾਲਸਾ
ਵਾਹਿਗੁਰੂ ਜੀ ਕੀ ਫਤਿਹ।
ਸਾਰੀਆਂ ਦੇਖ ਰਹੀਆਂ ਸੰਗਤਾਂ ਦਾ ਖੁੱਲੇ ਵਿਚਾਰ ਤੇ ਇੱਕ ਵਾਰੀ ਫੇਰ ਤੋਂ ਜੀ ਆਇਆਂ ਨੂੰ। ਅੱਜ ਦੇ ਐਪੀਸੋਡ ਦੇ ਉੱਤੇ ਸਾਡੇ ਨਾਲ ਇੱਕ ਬੜੀ ਖਾਸ ਸ਼ਖਸੀਅਤ ਜੁੜੀ ਹੈ, ਭਾਈ ਸਾਹਿਬ ਭਾਈ Tejpaul Singh Bainiwal, who is a Sikh scholar, doctor if I'm not mistaken, a PhD, and he has written a very intense, interesting book full of Sikh history artifacts, specifically around the Gadri Babe. And the Gadri Babe, as we know, were a group of Sikhs that basically fought against the British government, and they came to America. They spread the message of anti-establishment, the colonialism. But I don't want to speak too much of it. We have an expert here who's going to be talking to us. So thank you for coming, Tejpaul. I really appreciate it.
Of course. Thank you for having me.
Of course. And let's get into it. Let's start. So I want to ask you, how did you get about learning about the Gadri Babe? What made you interested in it? Was it, you being born from Stockton, which is, coincidentally Gadri Babe da Asthan, but you also studied this in school as well, so please tell us a little bit.
Yeah, no, exactly what you said, bro. I think what it was for me was growing up and going to Stockton Gurdwara since I was a child, and every time they would do ardas, they'd always say Gadri Babe da Itihasik Asthan, and behind the stage Uchvi likha Gadri Babe da Itihasik Asthan, but growing up, we would never really know what that meant when we were young children. But again, when the 100th anniversary of Stockton Gurdwara Sahib happened in 2012, I was in high school at that moment, and I've always been a history buff. Always loved reading about history. Just never had the opportunity to learn more about Sikh history in the U.S. or just Sikh history in general outside of the Gurdwara setting. So the fact that we had the oldest Gurdwara in the United States just down the street from where I was living, and the fact that we never learned about it in a public education system always sparked my interest as to, why didn't we learn about such a rich history? Because for the centennial celebration of Stockton Gurdwara, there was a 2-day conference where, we had scholars from the East, scholars from the West, so scholars from Panjab, scholars from UK, scholars from the US, and they all came to Stockton to talk about the Gadri Babe, talk about the importance of Stockton Gurdwara. And for me, that was the first time as a teenager where I heard the importance of the Gurdwara and the importance of Gadri Babe and that Itihasik Asthan. It wasn't just a phrase anymore at that point. At that point, it was like, no, there's something behind it. Yeah. So I had the opportunity to volunteer for that conference and work with some of the uncles who organized the conference, and had the opportunity to look at Stockton Gurdwara's historic archive. They had meeting minutes from the original Gadri Babe who came and established Stockton Gurdwara. A year before, actually, when they were planning to celebrate the centennial, so in 2011, when they announced that we're going to do a year-long of festivities to celebrate Stockton Gurdwara's centennial celebration, that's when they brought the original printing press that was used by the Gadri Babe from a house in Berkeley that was owned by former Gadri Babe back to Stockton Gurdwara. And this was the first time in almost a century where the printing press made its way to Stockton Gurdwara. So,
and it's still there now, right?
Yes, so it's still there now. So that was the first time where, again, this excitement for me started developing about, we have such a rich history here, and listening to all these scholars talk about who the Gadri Babe were. And from there, I just started doing independent research, started doing more research on Stockton Gurdwara Sahib, picking up books, going to random archives. Archives in San Bruno, they have a huge record of the Hindu-German conspiracy trials, which took place in San Francisco. So just with everything that was happening in 2012 and after that in 2015, there was a centennial celebration for the Shahidi of Kartar Singh Sarabha and the other Gadri Babe who lost their lives during the Lahore conspiracy case in 1915.
Could you tell us a little bit more about that? And also, like, some of the big names.
Yes, sorry. I know we were still on the main side of it. But yeah, I mean, so Stockton Gurdwara has such a rich history with the Gadri Babe. A lot of the founders of the Ghadar Leher were also founders or key members of Stockton Gurudwara Sahib. Some of the names that we hear pretty often is Baba Son Singh Pakhna, the first Pradhan, first president of the Ghadar party. They weren't in Stockton, but the other names that we hear very closely is Baba Jawala Singh, Baba Vasakha Singh, Kartar Singh Sarabha, Baba Harnam Singh. So all of these individuals were in Stockton, and they were some of the key members in Stockton Gurdwara Sahib. And although you know, some of the common history is, as it's told typically, is, you know, the Ghadar Leher was founded in 1913 in Astoria, Oregon. And then it made its way from the Pacific Northwest down to San Francisco and down to Stockton Gurdwara Sahib.
Oregon?
Yes.
That's interesting. I didn't know that.
Yeah, so it was, because there was a large population of Punjabi Sikhs in the Pacific Northwest as well, with
Working
Canada
the
being there,
railroads.
in BC, and then also in the lumber mills. So Washington, Oregon area, along the Columbia River, there are a lot of people working there as well. So it was also a common middle ground for, again, if Sikhs are coming from BC, versus those who are traveling from, you know, Stockton area to meet in Oregon, in Astoria, Oregon. And so that's when it was officially formalized. But there's traces of what we know as the Ghadar in the Stockton Gurdwara archives. They talk about, you know, the need for newspapers. They specifically write in the Stockton Gurdwara archives that, you know, akhbar hathyar, right?
Yeah.
So like the importance of media being a weapon.
Yeah.
And they launched a newspaper as well. That predates the Ghadar newspaper. And again, but it talked about the ideas of Raj. It talked about the ideas of sovereignty.
Interesting. Now, this is a question that a lot of people have: is was this for Raj of Hindustan or was this for Raj of Punjab? Right.
Yeah, that's a big question that comes up, right? They always try to, a lot of folks, especially a lot of scholars that focus on the Ghadar party, they talk about it being a secular movement. They talk about, no, it was, some names that come up is like also like Lala Hardyal, right?
Yeah.
And he's given a lot of prominence. And then again is Comrade Movement, communism, all of these names get thrown at it, nationalist movement. But if you just read the writings of the prominent leaders, the Gur Sikhs who were there, Baba Son Singh Pakhna, Baba Vasakha Singh, and talk about just their own writings. They're saying that, you know, people call us communists for starting the Ghadar party, but we look at the concept of Sarbat Tapala, right? We look at the concept of Raj. We look at the concept of we won't stand by tyranny and face injustice and not do anything about it.
Yeah.
So the concepts that Baba Jawala Singh, Baba Vasakha Singh, Baba Son Singh Pakhna are talking about are concepts that predate the ideas of communism, that predate the ideas of what Hindustan is.
These are topics coming from Guru Sahib's time, right? So arguably
Exactly.
we could say that these were still perspectives of a Sikh, you know, someone who, like Raj Bhavana hai hai, right?
Yeah, exactly. That's what it was. And it's not until until like the 2000s, post 2000s, where we get scholars who are talking about the Sikh aspect or the Sikhi aspect of the Ghadar Leher. I mean, in the 1900s and post-partition, right, all these scholars are talking about it being a communist movement or Kamradanda, right? And they try to distort the Sikhi aspect of it. And it's very intentional. There's a reason why they do it. Again, if you're able to get such a powerful movement like the Ghadar party, because even you have the Desh Gantari, you got Desh Gantara Hall, Ashram Hall, I forget the exact term, but it's in Jalandhar, right? And ultimately, it was meant to be a tribute to the Gadri Babe. But again, if anything that's relating to the Gadri Babe and you're talking about tribute to the Gadri Babe, and if in there you're talking about these ideas of Raj and Sikh sovereignty, these ideas that the Gurus were telling us, it's not beneficial for the Indian state. So again, just painting, and there's even moments, I was talking to some individuals who I had the opportunity to interview, they talked about how when they were in schools in Punjab in the 60s, 70s, 80s, they're talking about, again, we're talking about the Gadri Babe being comrades or communists, but in 60s, 70s, and 80s in schools in Punjab, they're teaching about how Guru Gobind Singh Ji Maharaj was a communist, right, and how they were a comrade, right. So the idea was to take key Sikh figures, whether it's Gadri Babe or whether it's the Guru Sahibs themselves, and paint them as individuals who who live in a pro-India nation.
So Hindustan li kaam kar rahe si, right,
exactly,
basically.
Exactly.
Yeah, and they did the same thing with like Bhagat Singh and Udham Singh too, right?
Yes.
And this is something interesting because so I'm a student who graduated from UC Davis, right? And as you know, UC Davis has some history with the Ghadar party as well. What I learned while I was at Davis is that at some times, like during the summers when the Gadri Babe, they would be in Berkeley, they would be coming to Stockton, but on the way, they would come on bicycles. But on the way, they would stop by Davis and work on the farms and stuff there, right? So one of the founders of UC Davis, George Pierce, his basically right-hand man, his PA, personal assistant, he was, I believe, the secretary or something of the Ghadar party, Munsha Singh, right? And he had a hand in basically developing UC Davis, right? And that's something interesting that we see. I think it's interesting as a student of Davis as well.
Yeah, and that's what it is, right? We have a lot of these Gadri Babe, like sometimes when people talk about the Gadri Babe as well, they just say it was a peasant movement, right? It was just laborers who got together. There wasn't really any intelligence behind what they were doing. But again, a lot of them were students, a lot of them were educated individuals. They had backgrounds that was beyond just kheti bari. And again, like you're saying, like Munsha saying, right? He helped develop UC Davis, right? He was right-hand man to Pierce. A lot of their jeevanis and, whether we're looking at within the Sikh Soch, right? There's even, there's articles and books out there that talks about a lot of these Gadri Baba and how much banis they had gone, right? But then so that's one aspect of it, right? Like looking at them as Gur Sikhs, but then also looking at them as scholars and educators as well, people who actually made a difference in the everyday life, right? So you mentioned the story with that connection to UC Davis. Baba Jawala Singh, who was one of the founders of Stockton Gurudwara Sahib and one of the key organizers of the Ghadar Lehr as well, he owned 500 acres of farmland in the Stockton area in the early 1900s. And at that time, he was competing with another farmer, a Japanese farmer, George Shima, as the largest landowners in the county.
Wow.
So,
and what year is this?
This was from 1908 to 1912.
Wow.
So Baba Jawala Singh was able to develop so much land in partnership with Baba Vasaka Singh and a few other Singhs. But when it came time for the Ghadar party, when it came time to actually do something for the movement, they weren't looking at themselves and the jameen that they had on, let me build on this. Because right now, when you look at Stockton history or San King County history here in California, people know who George Shima is just because he ended up becoming one of the wealthiest immigrants in all of the county.
Very influential, I'm sure.
Very influential. And Baba Jawala Singh was up there with them, but once the need for Gurdwara to be established, once the need for a movement like the Ghadar, once they realized the need for these to be established, their entire focus was for that. So again, it's always amazing to me that the amount of resources that they had back then was limited, the amount of people that they had was limited, the amount of asset that they had was limited, but the amount of work that they did was crazy. It was immense. Not only Stockton Gurdwara Sahib, but they had the farm that Baba Jawala Singh had. It ultimately turned into a training ground for him. That's where they would build bombs. They would do training like how to again control and use
militias and
guerrilla warfare. They even hired a former soldier to come out and train them. Some people say in some of the Gadri Baba's handwritten letters, they talk about a guy named Jack, an American named Jack, who taught them how to use guns. So again, they had this mindset, and the reason why they did this, and a lot of people aren't aware of this history, is because they also did it in secrecy. And it wasn't because they didn't want the public to know. It was because they understood the laws of the land at that time. So again, the Ghadar party officially is formed in 1913. And in 1912, Stockton Gurdwara is established. Also in May 1913, California passes the Alien Land Law Act, which ultimately means that immigrants can't own land. So again, if the Stockton Gurdwara does anything so Gurdwara was safe because they bought the land before the bill was passed. So it was safe. But if they did anything to even remotely seem like they were going against the American government or against American laws,
The state, yeah.
that could have been stripped of them, right? So we
Yeah.
could have lost Stockton Gurdwara if they intentionally, outwardly said, no, Stockton Gurdwara is with the Ghadar Lahore.
Yeah.
But so that reason, even though Stockton Gurdwara was a key organizing space, in a lot of the official records, you don't see that direct connection. But when you start reading their handwritten diaries or handwritten letters, that's when they're making the connection that no, there was a connection, but we kept it separate.
Yeah.
And then like the farm, right? Again, because it was out of the city, it was kind of further away. That was able to be their main training ground. Things that can have been seen as extremist activities or where the state would have had issues with. And then San Francisco, where they had the main headquarters, which a lot of people are aware of San Francisco, and the Ghadar Ashram. That was, you can say, where the Ghadar Press was out of. That's where all the students from UC Berkeley were. So the intellects were in Berkeley. The people who were training to be the soldiers were at Holt. And then Stockton Gurdwara was a key organizing space. So it's like all three of these spaces weren't working in silos. And sometimes we kind of talk about them in silos. But they were very well organized.
Yeah, very well organized.
Yeah.
And we've heard a lot of stories. So I took a class with Professor Ranganath at UC Davis, and she's done extensive study on the history of Gadri Babe in this area as well. And she was explaining how like basically they had like an underground network. They would have like secret meetings, and they would be meeting with like like different agents and stuff of like the crown, or even with like the people in India and stuff like that, just so they can keep the movement alive, right? And obviously sometimes you need to engage with like British governments and stuff like that, right?
Yeah.
And something interesting that we did learn is that they even had agents inside the British government that they were talking to. Apne Sardar Bande, who I guess they were working for the British government at the time. And they would just communicate on levels that we can't even comprehend today.
Yeah.
And so I think that's very interesting.
Yeah, and that's what it is, right? They used a lot of different tactics. They had, and some of this also brought tension within the organization and the movement itself. Whereas some folks believe that they shouldn't have any relations with people who are part of the Sarkar, and some people are like, no, like we still need to maintain open
diplomacy or something.
Exactly, right. And again, we see that even today, right? Like difference of opinions. How do we tackle these issues of Khalistan, and how do we go about some of these issues that we're facing today? So. These were some of the same discussions that the community was facing back then and the Gadri Babe were having back then.
I think that's funny because they say history repeats itself.
Exactly.
It's in front of our eyes.
Yeah, and that's what it is. And a lot of even, the acts that the Indian government uses today against activists, they're bills that were ultimately initially passed by the British, right? So when, again, the British was trying to shut down the Ghadar party and any sort of oppression or any sort of revolution. And when the British first came in, John Butchke, they targeted the Khalsa army. There's a number of British historians who talk about the fiercest army that the British faced in all of Asia was the Khalsa army. So it was a tactic of the British army when they first colonized, Punjab, was to take the weapons away from the Khalsa army. And once they were able to accomplish that, then because again, Punjabis, Sikhs, we're very we're full of pride as well. Anak, right? So what the British did, they spun that back on us. They're like, no. You guys are great warriors. We didn't mean to steal it from you guys, but you guys now just fight for us, right? So that's why we see from the fall of the Sikh Empire to, again, the late 1800s, a lot of Sikhs joining the not only the British Army but also joining the British colonial police force, and that's where a lot of the Sikhs really ultimately began traveling beyond Punjab. And that's where the story of even Baba Vasakha Singh starts. Baba Vasakha Singh joined the army initially, and Baba Vasakha Singh's actually, they have a very fascinating story. Their Dadaji or Pardadaji, they were there in Anandpur Sahib in 1699. And again, not one of the Panj Pyare, but they were amongst the other Sikhs who take Amrit first in 1699. And then Baba Vasaka Singh's elders were part of the missile periods as well, fought alongside.
So Jeevani Singh, you know.
Jeevani Hagisi, yeah. So growing up, they heard about the stories of Vasaki, about the Khalsa, about the missile period. They heard about all these stories, but then it was embedded in them that Khalsa is we're the martial race, right? And then again, we have that in us, but then the British use that to be like, you're the martial race. God gave you that martial race ability to fight on behalf of the British, right? So fight for us.
Yeah.
Baba Vasaka Singh agreed. It wasn't like a one-on-one, but like there was just a mentality that a lot of individuals had. So Baba Vasaka Singh was amongst them, and they joined the British Army. But it was in 1906, 1907, Sardar Ajit Singh, who's the Chacha Ji of Shahid Bhagat Singh. They started the Pagdi Sanwal Jatta movement, and what they did was ultimately standing against British oppression, and they went around to different British officers and British Army encampments and was ultimately preaching and telling them the atrocities of the British. And Baba Vasaka Singh was there and heard one of the speeches at one of the rallies, and that was what made them leave the army. So they left the British Army. They ultimately then went to China, became a police officer, but then they saw the oppression that the police officers were, what they were doing to the common folks in China, in British China. And from there, then they came to the U.S. And then they had that idea of, what is happening in the U.S., what is happening in, other
so they
British
were
colonies.
like basically, they knew stuff about geopolitics. They knew about, statecraft and different, types of, I guess, military-civilian relations because they were in military. And I think that's something interesting, like our Qawm, even since the 1800s, and this is, going back, I seen a picture of a Sikh who was, apparently he worked for a London branch, a military service, during the U.S. Civil War. Right, so Sikhs are going back to military service way before World War I, right? We know about Bhagat Singh Thind and people like that, but like even prior to that we have Sikhs working in British Crown or British or U.S. government, and at Thontak, it's something interesting. I was reading into some history of like Israel and Palestine, which is an ongoing conflict today, but even 150 years ago, there were Sikhs fighting for the British Crown in Israel, like during the Battle of Sinai, and during the siege. Basically there were some pictures of, it was called the King's Own Firozpur Regiment, right? It was a regiment of Sikhs deployed directly by the king, the crown, I believe King Charles, directly into Israel, right, in Palestine. And you can even go today, I believe, in I think one of the cities in Israel, Jerusalem, maybe Tel Aviv, and they have a cemetery for like one of the soldiers, a bunch of the soldiers, and a majority of the headstones are Sikhs. You can go on the names and you can read them, and it'll say Singh. And I think that just goes to show that like our Qawm has always been martial, right? Not just for ourselves, but for any kind of government. Right?
And that's what it is, right? Like we most definitely are a martial race, and a lot of some governments. I mean, we should always be martial like a race. We're in martial race in general, but we should be standing up for our own community as well. But what tends to happen is sometimes we see this as we're the martial race. We must join, any sort of army. But again, a lot of these armies for different nations, their views don't align with Sikhi values.
They don't.
Right. So when we say that, yes, we're a martial race, but the Khalsa is meant to stand up against injustice, yes. But then sometimes what people end up doing is they co-opt that into being like, yeah, the Khalsa was always meant to stand up against, injustice. So that's why we're serving for, the British Royal Army, or that's why we end up joining, even though the British...
They use it to justify their causes, basically.
Exactly. So, but yeah, I mean, so the British, when they colonized Punjab, when they colonized the Sikhs, they understood that because even during the Sikh Empire, British had already colonized vast majority of South Asia. The Sikh Empire was one of the last strongholds in all of South Asia. But even though Maharaja Ranjit Singh signed treaties, British folks were still sending spies or sending researchers, hey, go learn about the Sikhs. Go learn what is it that gives them this power. Why is it that such a small Khalsa army is such a formidable foe?
I think there was something we talked about in one of our previous podcasts where I think the British government had authorized this their people basically to buy Punjabi Gade, right? And the price of the Gade were worth more than weapons, right? So basically they were valuing like Sikh books and Sikh granths just to research.
Yeah.
Be like, eh bani kitthon padde, like you know, into spirit kitthon aanda.
Yeah.
And where is that coming from? And it's coming from Gurbani, obviously.
Yeah.
Right?
Oh, he got that right. Like when we talk about the aspect of Sawa Lakh Se Ek Ladao, right? Like when we look at Sikh history in general, we've never been the majority in any battle, right? We've always been a small minority. But again, when we look at the battles we fought, right?
We're always the people that change the tide of the war.
Exactly, and that's what it is. So like that was something that was known. But yeah, I mean, so the British understood that. The British spent their individuals. They learned that okay, it's in the Bani, right? Like Bani is telling them to stand up against injustice, right? So like again, and the British colonizers, they've colonized again a large majority of the world, right? At one point or another, they've learned these tactics, and you know, whether, I know this is not meant to be a critique or looking at the Sikh Empire, but when we look at the Sikh Empire, initially, you know, we had leaders like Akali Phula Singh and Hari Singh Nalwa who were there and supportive of Maharaja Ranjit Singh, but ultimately Maharaja Ranjit Singh also gave a lot of power to non-Sikhs, non-Amritari Sikhs who didn't understand the value of Sikhi and the value of Guru Granth Sahib and didn't understand these concepts. So then they only understood power and politics, right? But for Sikhs, power and politics is through always the lens of Gurbani, is always through the lens of Sikhi. Again, Miri Piris hold such a close relationship, but if you start separating them, and that's what happened. So that's what really happened with the Sikh Empire, and that's where eventually the Dogras come into power, they become more influential, and there were Amritari Gursikhs who were talking to Maharaja Ranjit saying, hey, don't let these individuals into influential powers, places of power, but yeah, so that's what ultimately happened, and then the treaties that were signed. So the British understood where the power of Sikhs came from and where the power of the Khalsa army came from, and they ultimately utilized that to spin the narrative on us, and then were able to recruit so many Sikhs to join the British army. And so the aspect or the tactic for the Ghadar party was when they wanted to go back to Punjab, that they understood there was a lot of Sikh regiments in the British army. So they were going to these regiments and trying to recruit them.
So that's, I guess, one of the reasons that justify why the Gadri Babe would be talking to, you know, agents of the British Crown and stuff like that to further their agenda.
Yeah, but again, just want to say again that wasn't the belief of all Gadri Babe, right? That all of them were in the belief that we should be talking to the Crown in one or another. And that's kind of where, because some Gursikhs believe that if you start, you know, talking to the Crown, we don't necessarily know where their loyalties are. Are they loyal to the Crown or are they loyal to the Gaum?
Yeah.
Right? So, and that's ultimately what happens is, you know, almost any movement that the Gaum starts, the Panth starts, it's almost never an external force that brings us down. Almost always it's an internal force that brings us down, whether it's spies within, corruption within, whatever it may be. And that's what happened with the Ghadar party is, you know, they started bringing more folks in because, again, once you go to Punjab, when you're taking on an entire, you know, a superpower like the British were at the time, you need resources. And again, earlier when I was mentioning that the British tactic intentionally was to strip the Khalsa army of their weapons. So when they did that, when the Gadri Babe went back to Punjab, they need to get weapons. And again, so where do they go? They go to the Sikh regiments like, hey, we need hatiyar, we need to fight this battle, join us. Or they go and try to break into an army, right, or armory, right, and steal weapons from the government. There are those who talk to, you know, some people from the government like, hey, understand that this is a Sikh cause, you should think about the Qaum, this isn't the benefit for the Sikhs, it's not a benefit for Punjab. So some of them agreed, they were able to recruit some officers, but again, some were still loyal to the Crown and only put on a show that Koina will help you guys. So exactly, and again, once again, any movement we really look at, right, it's almost always from within, right? Shortest Sahibzade, right, beginning with them, right?
Chandu, Gangu, everything.
Right, and all of them, and then when we look at, you know, the missile periods, or whether we look at the Ghadar Leher, Babbar Kali Leher, the post-84 movements, almost always has been from within. So it was the same thing that ultimately happened. That's why there was a huge disagreement between some of the leaders, whether should we be trusting these individuals who are loyal to the Crown in these permanent or prominent positions within the Ghadar Leher. So there was a lot of back and forth. Some people disagreed, some people agreed. So again, that's ultimately what was the downfall of the movement as well. But yeah, that's why they were talking to people who were part of the British Army.
So do you think there could have been maybe some better outcomes had we maybe not included some outside people or, created coalitions, which I think something our COM tends to do, right? Because we always look for support, right?
Yeah. I think that's an interesting question, right? I think it's easy for us to kind of look back at and recognize the mistakes that were made. But one thing to understand is back then they needed weapons. And where were they going to get weapons in Punjab? It was either the Sikh regiments or from British armories. They even tried to get it through different allies. So the Ghadar Lahar here in California, initially when it starts in 1913, in 1914 when World War I starts, there's a call from the Ghadar newspaper that, now's the time. British focus is in Europe. Now we can go back to Punjab and,
talk about Azadi.
Yeah. So in a period of a few months, roughly 7,000 to 8,000 folks go back to Punjab. But again, there's no weapons, right? So they have the numbers, but they didn't have the weapons. So they needed it somehow, some way. So a lot of the Gursikhs initially went back, late 1914s, early 1915s. And there was a huge push, right? That's why we also get the first Lahore conspiracy case in 1915 as well. But those who stayed in the U.S., some of them started building allyship with the German embassy here in the United States. Again, their mindset was the enemy of my enemy is my friend.
Is my friend.
Right?
Yeah.
So again, Germany and UK are at war. Didn't turn out because the enemy of my enemy for the British perspective, then the U.S. government now is supporting. So the U.S. government also, although they kept an eye on the Ghadar Lahar, they didn't care much because until the Gadri Babe started getting involved with the Germans.
Yeah. And this was done primarily through, the Azad Hind Fauj and Subhash Chandra Bose.
Them as well, and that was the Azad Hind Fauj in Europe or in the Middle
more
East.
World War II.
Right? Yeah, and more World War II, right? But this was World War I time, and then very early on, so the Hindu-German conspiracy trial, which I briefly mentioned early.
Yeah, can you explain a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so it came out of the allyship that they tried to develop with the German government. So the embassy here in California, ultimately what they were trying to do were, there was an agreement made to send German weapons, and it was thousands of weapons and thousands of bullets and ammunition, along with Ghadar newspapers, on a ship from here to ultimately to a port in India, and then from there ultimately make his way to leadership in the Ghadar party. The Gadri were working with the German embassy through and through. Unfortunately, they were caught due to a number of different spies and a number of different reasons, and the court case that came out of that was known as the Hindu-German conspiracy trials, and that was from 1916 to 1918 roughly in San Francisco. At that moment, it was the largest, the longest, and the most expensive trial west of the Mississippi.
Wow.
In U.S. history. And even in that trial, one of the individuals in that trial ultimately made the decision that they were going to spy and pretty much give up all the information that they had on the Gadri Babe. And in that trial, his name is Ramchandra. In that trial, what ultimately happens is another individual by the name of Ram Singh, he, in the courtrooms, pulls out a gun and shoots Ramchandra.
Wow.
And then he's immediately killed by another officer. So Ram Singh also dies that moment. But he shoots Ramchandra before he's able to give up more Gadri Babe. So that also takes place during the trial.
Okay. And this is here in America?
San Francisco.
Wow.
Yeah. And one of my friends actually told me that when they did a tour of the San Francisco courtroom, that the tour guide actually told him about that story.
Okay. So this is preserved in San Francisco's history.
Yes. Yes. So how much and how well is it preserved? How much of the Sikh narrative is in it? How much of a Khalsa perspective is in it? That I'm not too sure, but that's on us, right? Too, and that's ultimately the reason why I wanted to pursue a degree focusing on Sikh American history and just Sikh Itihas in general was recognizing that we don't really have a lot of folks who are telling our own stories, right? And the fact that Gadri Babe were called comrades and communists, right? That's not true, right? So a lot of that was the reason why I really wanted to pursue this, because even though some of the history may be preserved, it may not be preserved in the most accurate manner.
Yeah, well, I think the Panth is very glad that we have scholars like you, researching this. I think a lot of our history has been misplaced, or it's being manipulated, and that's just one of the more reasons why we need Sikhs coming into these lines of work, educating themselves and then going on to educate others.
Yeah, because and that's one of the biggest things, right? Is educating ourselves and educating others, right? I think one of the first and foremost, and I was having this conversation with a friend of mine, is the need to also uneducate and then re-educate ourselves, right? Because if we look back to like the education that Sikhs provide, even our own community, whether we look at the stories that we have for bachche, right? Khalsa schools, Gurmat schools, Punjabi schools, whatever you may call it, at your respective Gurdwara. We went through it as well. Like the Sakyan that we've heard, and then now as I've grown older and have a different understanding of life and a different understanding of these ideas of Raj, sovereignty, power, azadi, and all this stuff, and different understanding of how those governments in power, whether it may be the Mughals or whether it's the British or the Indian government now, always tried to utilize our history or to distort it in one way or another, right? Like I mentioned earlier, British utilized the fact that we're a martial race to recruit Sikhs into their army. Similarly, a lot of the tales that we're told as a general population, I'm not talking about those who actually read, right, and read the books, but as a general population, a lot of the tales that we're told is such a clean version that they want us to think that Sikhs are non-violent, Sikhs are very flowery. They don't really get into the in-depth versions of it, right? Like
into the blood and gore.
We don't talk about Miri Piri as a joint concept, right? We don't talk about a lot of the idea that Badshahi was given to us not from, again, some people want to talk about Guru Hargobind Sahib or Guru Gobind Singh or Guru Granth Sahib when Guru Granth Sahib Ji was given the Gurgaddi, but Guru Nanak Sahib Ji talks about Badshahi, right? There are concepts and ideas of Badshahi that are shown through Guru Nanak Sahib.
It was started through Guru Nanak. Babar Nu Jabar Kehna, that's a direct act of war, right?
Exactly, right? So, but again, when we talk about Guru Nanak Sahib Ji, right? We don't talk about them being an activist. We don't talk about them being
Jungi
or through the lens of like a government, a troublemaker, right? We just say like,
he was an old guy. He used to walk. He preached the word of God.
Yeah, so
that's a very clean version of it.
Yeah, and that's just one example, right? Like what we do in terms of with the Guru's story, right? With Guru Nanak Sahib Ji, but that's how it's been. Like our history has been distorted to tell a specific narrative, and now it's on us to understand that narrative was created by an outsider. It was given to us. Yeah. It was given to us by an outsider. That's not the narrative that Akal Purkh gave us. That's not the narrative that the Guru Sahibs gave us. So in order to really understand what the Guru Sahibs give us, like we have to break beyond like these post-colonial texts and these post-colonial stories that were given to us, and really understand what Guru Granth Sahib Ji is saying and what the Gurus were trying to preach. And they talk about Padshah, they talk about these concepts of sovereignty. I think that's key.
Yeah, they explain all these concepts to us. I think it's on us to just ask those right questions. And I think one of the biggest examples that we can learn from not setting our narrative correctly, and just going back to the Gadri Babe, is even during the time of the Gadri Babe, I think there were tactics that I guess the deep state or the center of India, or the Hindu political head organizations, they would refer to the Gadri Babe as Hindus, right? They would refer to us as Indians. Well, India wasn't really a concept back then until 47, but they would refer to us as the same as Hindus, right? And even during, like, for example, the time of Congressman Dilip Singh Saund, right? He was referred to as an Indian, even though he wasn't, right? He, when he passed away, he had his pog in a Gurdwara in DC, right? He was given the rights of a Sikh. But that's same for a lot of the Gadri Babe, right? They were staunch Sikhs, but they were referred to as Indians or Hindus, correct?
Yeah. So, one of the biggest things, and even if you look at a lot of the early newspapers in the United States, Sikhs are referred to as Hindus. Even with the establishment of Stockton Gurdwara Sahib, they talk about, a new Hindu temple being founded in Stockton. The idea and the two different things. I don't want to conflate them into one. One was, Hindus in South Asia who are trying to say that Sikhs are part of Hinduism.
Yeah,
that is one.
Yeah.
But then there's the second one where just this lack of knowledge or just this lack of trying to doing more research.
Yeah.
Hindu was utilized as a ethnic kind of term rather than like just a religious term. So anyone from South Asia was termed to be Hindu. So again, sometimes in some of the old newspapers, they refer to Sikhs as Hindu Sikhs, right? Or the Hindu Sikh temple.
Yeah, Hindu
right?
Sikh.
Yeah, so it wasn't like, oh, you can only be Hindu or Sikh. So they just didn't understand what Hindu was. There wasn't this idea of what Hindu was back then or Hinduism was. So it was just anyone from India, anyone from South Asia was a Hindu. And then even with specifically, like, I'm glad you mentioned like Dilip Singh Saund, and with him and like, yes, a Sikh through and through. They were active when they were in Punjab before they migrated to the U.S. They come to the U.S. in 1920. Before they came to the U.S., they were studying in Amritsar in the 1910s, 19 teens, when the Ghadar Lahar was active. They were, and Dilip Singh Saund loved politics, and they mentioned it in their autobiography. But what's not mentioned in the autobiography, and what's really not mentioned in any accounts of Dilip Singh Saund, is that Dilip Singh Saund was actively participating in the Ghadar Lahar in one way or another. Most are just saying that, you know, he was being aware. He always had Ghadar newspapers with him. He was keeping tabs on what's going on. But again, he was still a college student. There's not much that he was able to do. When they came to the U.S. in 1920, again, their education at Berkeley was funded by Stockton Gurudwara Sahib.
Dilip Singh Saund?
Dilip Singh Saund.
Interesting.
But even in the Stockton Gurdwara meeting minutes, when it's the Babbar Akali Lahar going on, they talk about how Dilip Singh Saund came to Stockton Gurdwara and gave such a powerful speech on why the Babbar Akalis were so important to the movement and why we need to look at their qurbani. Right, and they specifically mentioned...
And this is Dilip Singh Saund, the first Sikh U.S. congressman.
Yes, that Dilip Singh Saund is talking about the Babbar Akalis being, you know, figures that we need to look up to, right? But then again, Dilip Singh Saund becomes a politician through and through, understanding that, you know, so ultimately one reason why they left Punjab and came to the U.S. was one of their teachers was telling them that, you know, you're active, you're young, you're a smart individual, but you're also keeping tabs and keeping up to date with what's going on with the Ghadar party. The government has your name down. For your own safety, you should leave. So this is, again, what Dilip Singh Saund's family, his nephew is saying this, that Dilip Singh Saund left Punjab because the British government was looking at Dilip Singh Saund. So he had that passion in him, but ultimately then he comes here, becomes a politician, strives to make a name for himself, and when he gets elected as the first Sikh, first Asian American member of Congress, then it's the Red Scare that's here, right? Communism is going to take over,
Cold War.
And Cold War is going on. The U.S. and Russia at odds. Again, if we look at geopolitics, people didn't know where India stood. Were they with Russia? Were they with the U.S.? So now you have the very first Sikh, very first Punjabi, very first Asian member of Congress, but the U.S. wants to use Dilip Singh Saund to get India on their side in this Cold War era, right? So that's why everything with Dilip Singh Saund was as the congressman from India, the Indian congressman, the Indian leader who's going to take, you know, U.S.-India relations to the next level. So it was because they were specifically also using Dilip Singh Saund to fight against Russia and communism and the Red Scare. So yes, it was that tactic to bring Sikhs into this idea of an Indian state. That's one side. But then also the U.S. tactic was completely different. So
obviously, इन्होंने अपना मतलब कढ़ना था, right?
So there's always multiple things to look at and take into consideration.
That's interesting because I know at the same time, you know, there was President, I believe, Harry Truman, and then afterwards Eisenhower. They were all looking to engage India and Nehru and all these guys. I think there was even the president of, I believe it was Colombia at the time, before he had gone on to become the U.S. president, and he had hosted Nehru in his farm at Gettysburg in Virginia. And he basically met one-on-one with Nehru, trying to talk to him into, you know, supporting the U.S. side in this Cold War. And in fact, he wrote a diary. I'll go back and confirm which president this was. I believe it was the 35th or 36th president. Okay. And he basically wrote about Nehru that he is a very ignorant guy. He's not a good person. He's, not educated to be leading the nation, right? So I think that's interesting that, at the same time we have Sikh leaders who are being, I guess, they were basically, supported by Gurudwara, like Stockton Gurdwara, right? And the United States government was trying to utilize them for geopolitics, right?
Yeah.
And that's not something that we see today at all, right? I wish we did, right? We wish we had Gurdwara supporting students in geopolitics or going on to, represent us on an international level so that we wouldn't have to talk to, people like Nehru and Gandhi.
I mean, Stockton Gurdwara, I mentioned it very briefly, but I talk about like the resources back then and the money back then and the sheer numbers of the population of the Sikh Qaum back then, right? But they did so much with so little. And yeah, like you said, like it's sad to see because I as a historian reading what the Gadri Baba did, what Stockton Gurdwara did 100 years ago with such little resources, and now looking at the resources that we have and the population that we have, the source that we have, we aren't anywhere close to what the Gadri Baba were doing in terms of how they were organized. Again, starting a transnational movement to free South Asia of British rule when British were one of the most powerful, if not the most powerful.
They were the powerful. The sun never sets on the British Empire.
Exactly, but it's said, right? But that's what it is, right? To start a transnational movement is one thing. Stockton Gurdwara also did a lot to start schools specifically for girls and women in Punjab.
Stockton Gurdwara?
Stockton Gurdwara.
And there's history of this?
Yes, there's history and documentation of this. But even like specifically about like supporting students, Stockton Gurdwara actually owned 2 houses in Berkeley where students could stay rent-free, and then also provided scholarships for students.
Now, I did hear about that actually, that like there were houses in Berkeley owned by the Gadri Baba. And I've even heard this crazy rumor that the Indian embassy today in San Francisco used to be one of the houses owned by the Gadri Baba. Is that true?
It's not the current Indian embassy where we go to do the protest. That Indian embassy is not one of the houses that used to be owned. One of the former headquarters for the Ghadar party was bought by the Indian embassy and is now a museum that's run by the Indian embassy. So that one that they did take over. And again, there's uncles who have told me who were, because this was in the 60s or 70s, around there from what I've been told, that it was a committee member from Stockton Gurdwara who just gave it away for like almost nothing. Because one thing to take into consideration though is the history of Stockton Gurdwara and the politics of Stockton Gurdwara. Post-partition, because a lot of the Gursikhs who came initially left during the Ghadar party. And then because of very strict US laws, there wasn't a lot of immigration happening, so a lot of Sikhs weren't coming over. So the Sikhs who really stayed in the US at that time were those who ultimately wanted to create a life for themselves, but they couldn't bring any Punjabi Sikh women over, so they were marrying Mexican, marrying Gorian, and ultimately they assimilated.
I think sorry to cut you off, but we've heard a lot of histories of families that were like marrying Mexicans and other people of faith or other people from different communities and settling down, and like a lot of like we hear about the Mexican families that were marrying with the Punjabi men, and they would go on to work in the farms and stuff like that. So that's why I think today we see a lot of like Mexican guys and girls, and they have some type of Punjabi or history, or Punjabi history with them.
No, most definitely, and so that's what ends up happening, right? So once those Gursikhs leave who first came over, the 20s, 30s, and 40s, it's really just those who assimilated and wanted to start families. And then so once the partition happens, they don't understand the concepts, the Sikhi concepts of Raj, sovereignty, Patshahi. All of those individuals, Gursikhs had already left back to Punjab.
The Panthic people, basically.
Yeah, those people already left. So the people who were still in the U.S. were those people who were like, oh, look at us, the British finally left, we have our own nation.
Yeah.
Right? So they were very Stockton Gurdwara, after partition, up until 1984 was very pro-India. They supported the wars that India was fighting, and they sent financial support. They would invite elected officials from the Indian Parliament to come speak at the Gurdwara. Ultimately, from 47 to 84, Stockton Gurdwara was a extension of the Indian embassy here in the U.S. And that's just because the mindset, right? The Panthik people were gone. There wasn't any mention in any Stockton Gurdwara records about the Punjabi Suba movement or the loss of more of Punjab land, right? But again, there's mentions in the early 1900s about these concepts and these ideas of our land. So again, we really get Sikhs who are comfortable in living in the US, right? Sikhs who we're living here, we're okay. Let's not worry about that. Exactly, right? So at that point, then they're like, oh, we have our own nation now, right? Not understanding that India is not our nation, right? It's never been our nation. So because of that, that mindset, and this was pre-84, so because of that mindset, some of the leadership at that time, almost for no cost at all, gave up that house in San Francisco, which is now owned by the Indian Embassy.
Okay, that's very sad, very tragic for the calm. But just going on, talking about Stockton Committee, like what we see today, it's very controversial. We see a lot of like rumors and things happening. So it's almost safe to say that there was like a downward trend, right? From let's say the Gadri Babe and pre-47, like Stockton Gurdwara was one of the biggest Panthik hubs, and arguably it is today again, right? It's getting back there, right? It's the first Gurdwara to host the Khalistan flag. I think next week is Stockton Nagar Kirtan, and there's an ardas happening for Khalistan, right?
Yes.
And they're making it a very special moment, and I think everyone needs to come out and join it, right? To show our support and show that this is our history, right? And I think it's amazing that it's happening at Stockton Gurdwara specifically. Some place that it's close to home. A lot of the youth can relate to. I think a lot of the youth that are going to listen to this podcast have been going to Stockton Nagar Kirtan growing up. I think after Yuba City, it's one of the biggest Nagar Kirtans in America, right?
Yeah.
Or North America.
Yeah.
But it's very interesting learning about the history of this Gurdwara that we go to. It's not just some place that has Maharajas Prakash and Matha Tek Liya, Bahar Jaake Langar Kha Liya. Like no, there was a whole movement. Like today we have the Khalistan movement, right? But arguably Ghadar movement was just as big, if not bigger. And this is like 1920s, 1910, right?
Yes.
And like you said, back when they had no resources, we were even less than the population we are today in America. But we were, doing things in the world that no one had ever done before. And I think that's a message for the youth today, right? It's a wake-up call that, if college students, like Dilip Singh Saund and Gadhar Singh Sabha and these students at Berkeley and at different colleges around the world, if they can unify, for this calm, why can't we, right? And if there's anything you want to say about that, please feel free to.
Yeah, I think one of the biggest things for me is like, I think I'm blessed to have been able to read the Stockton Gurdwara meeting minutes, and that's one thing that I would encourage youth, if they're able to read Punjabi.
Are these available online?
Not available online. We're working on getting them uploaded online as well, so it is more accessible to the general public. But for the time being, again, it's always open access. Like if someone wants to go through them and read them, again, I've been given the seva to be the caretaker of the Khajana that's at Stockton Gurudwara Sahib. So always open door. Like if someone wants to go through them and read it, I highly encourage them because. I say I'm blessed because, like you said, in the early 1900s, Stockton Gurdwara was not only, it was the only Gurdwara in the United States up until the mid-1940s, but it wasn't just a Sikh temple or a religious institution. And that's a idea that we've a lot of Sikhs believe in now, that it's a Sikh place of worship or it's a Sikh temple. And when we do that, we really conflate what a Gurdwara is meant to be.
Yeah, it's a lot bigger than that.
Political, social, cultural, educational. And I'm not saying cultural in terms of like Punjabi culture, but like there's a Sikh culture as well. Educational and religious hub, right? Again, Kartarpur Sahib wasn't just to come do Vichar, right? There was society was living there. Anandpur Sahib wasn't just kirtan,
yeah, I know,
right?
like Guru Cars, we know in history, like they used to have like sports akhade, right?
Yeah,
and
exactly.
They used to have like even like you said, cultural, like it would be a place for the entire community to come together to get their news, to get like their religious like updates or anything going on in in the society in the pind.
Yeah.
And I think we shouldn't confine gurdwaras to just matha teko, langar shako.
Yeah, and that's what it is. Like with Stockton Gurdwara, like when I did the research, like you really see it through the meeting minutes that they understood that, and the Gursikhs who established Stockton Gurdwara understood that. But very quickly, when these Gursikhs left, and their understanding of Gurdwara being a sovereign institution left with them, then it became just a Sunday Gurdwara, right?
Yeah.
What we're used to now.
Yeah.
So that really begins in like the 1930s. Through the 1980s, right? Then with 84 happening, World Sikh News, right? The newspaper was also really picked up from Stockton Gurdwara Sahib. There was one of the first meetings that happened in the U.S. post 84 happened at Stockton Gurdwara Sahib. So having been a kind of an institution in the West,
it was like Sikhs, a lighthouse.
It was a lighthouse for Sikhs. For in the early 1900s, then I'd say in the 30s through the 80s, it really shifted, but then post 84 it really picked that up again, and like you said, now it's again holy, a Khalsan flag, and 19th is also a Panthik meeting on the day before the Nagit, and there's going to be a Panthik meeting to have Panthik Vichars at Stockton Gurdwara Sahib, and then like you said, there's going to be the Ardas, right? So that's one thing, and I would say yes, even though the Gurdwaras, and not just Stockton, but like just Gurdwaras in general, I feel like aren't doing what Stockton Gurdwara was doing 100 years ago, what the Gadri Babi were doing 100 years ago. Having 2 houses just for students to stay rent-free, providing scholarships for them, providing, starting schools in Punjab for bibiyan, aurtan, bachche, right? Funding and supporting an entire transnational movement. They were supporting the Rat Maryadas. Stockton Gurdwara was affiliated with starting getting the initial Rat Maryada going too, right? So there's a lot of different movements. Again, that I feel like could be a whole different episode in itself, focusing on what Stockton Gurdwara was doing and understanding what Gurdwaras were meant to be. But ultimately, like when I look at the history and what Stockton Gurdwara did back then, I'm still proud to say that like Stockton Gurdwara, I would say, is still much more active than a lot of other Gurdwaras that we see. But knowing what the history of Stockton Gurdwara was 100 years ago, I still think there's so much more we can do, and I'm just excited to be able to potentially teach the future generation this history and really let them know what that history is and what the Gurdwaras are meant to be, and hopefully we can make it a lighthouse again like it was back then. So
I mean, I think the Prabandhaks at Stockton have a lot to live up to, and I think it's very we're thankful for them as members of the community that they are still getting back to it. We have like these institutions like the museum there, and other like projects that you're working on. So we want to wrap it up here, but if we can just end with a couple pointers, like if you wanted to direct the Sangat to like a certain website or like an organization that you're working with, so they can get more information on the Gadri Babe. Of course, the Guru Card is available, and all the artifacts. But
one thing I have to just say right off the bat is we talk about the Prabandhaks, and like I'm talking about the Prabandhaks as well, but just right off the bat, I am a Prabandhak at Stockton Gurdwara now too, right? So I hold myself to this higher standard as well, right? Because knowing what that history is, I've been able to do Seva at Stockton Gurdwara in the Prabandhak committee for the past 3 years now. So yeah, I mean, it is like it's a reputation that we have to live up to, right? What they did, and being, again, like just being a fly on the wall in those committee rooms 100 years ago, right? I wish I was a fly on the wall in those rooms.
Just listening to the conversation.
Yeah. But in terms of like resources, one thing is we're trying to put out more resources on Stockton Gurdwara's website, stocktongurdwara.org. But we're also trying to, as I mentioned, really digitize the records, which that seva has been done by uncles years prior. But if there's we're looking to make sure there's nothing missing. So we want to make sure everything's digitized, properly organized, and then upload it. Unfortunately, we don't have that yet. But that is something that we're actively working on. So right now, the biggest way is, if someone does want to get more involved, is One is, again, just going to the website, and then if they want to come visit and actually see the meeting minutes, that's something they can come do. And then
And they can set that up with you, being a Parbandhak,
yes,
of course.
so they can set that up
that's
with
one of the good things.
yeah, so they can set that up with me. And again, as one of the Parbandhaks, I mean, easy, just contact the Gurdwara Sahib, whether it's the Gurdwara number, Gurdwara email. But then also, one of the biggest things that I want to just leave with is it's something that we also mentioned a little bit early on, is it's on us to make sure that we are educating ourselves and educating others. And one thing I want to make sure is, like, us living, for those people who are listening and living in the U.S., make sure we know what the history of, the Gadri Babe were in the U.S., right? We had such Gursikhs like Baba Jawala Singh, Baba Vasaka Singh, Son Singh Pakhna, Professor Teja Singh, who were here in the U.S., and we should be able to, like you're saying, Muncha Singh, right, at UC Davis, when you're a student there, you went out of your way to learn that history, right? Every student at UC Davis should know who he is. Every student at UC Berkeley should know the name of Kartar Singh Sraba or these individuals. Same thing if you're a watcher, if you're listening from Canada, right? We should know who Bhai Meva Singh is, the first Shaheed in North America. And again, so we should know who these names are and why they fought for Azadi, why they fought against...
They fought for us, so we could have this thought on our head.
Exactly, because again, we were discriminated against in the U.S., in Canada, in all these different nations. Our land was taken from us by the British back then, and now the Indian government holds it. So again, it's on us to educate ourselves. And so I just urge everyone to acknowledge that and know that it's not going to be on, myself or Simranpreet or one of these other individuals, but it's going to be a collective effort. And at the very least, what we can do is at least pick up a book or listen to a podcast.
Listen to this book.
Yeah,
this book right here by Tejpaul Singh, America ਵਿੱਚ ਸਿੱਖਾਂ ਦੇ ਸੰਖੇਪ ਇਤਿਹਾਸ. So we want to shout this out. We want to thank you for writing it as well.
Yeah.
But yeah.
Of course. Yeah. No. But that's what it is, right? Like, so there's this one, America ਵਿੱਚ ਸਿੱਖਾਂ ਦਾ ਸੰਖੇਪ ਇਤਿਹਾਸ. There's a lot of other folks who've written amazing books. But I know everyone doesn't read books. Everyone's not a big fan of books. But again, that's what I'm saying.
Podcast
that's what I'm saying. That's why we have podcasts, audiobooks. Again, sometimes katha as well, right? So there's a lot of resources out there. So I just urge everyone to, whatever it is, right? Whether you're a reader, pick up a book. If you want to listen to a podcast, listen to a podcast on, on Sikhi and the concepts of, Raj and Padshahi. If, again, Gatha is your thing. There's a lot of amazing Gathas out there as well. So
there's a lot of resources out there.
Yeah. So that's why I just say, just make sure, it's on us. So yeah, I mean.
Yeah. No, I agree. The best way to arm ourselves is to educate ourselves.
Yeah.
But yeah, so thank you very much, Tejpaul, for coming here.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, thank you to our viewers. Till next episode, Waheguru Ji Ka Khalsa, Waheguru Ji Ki Fateh.